will walk you through a short history of research on the Persepolis fortification archive as an indication of the debate that is currently still ongoing. Just to refresh your memory, we have talked about Persepolis fortification archive several times, and Mark has particularly said a few things about it, but just to make sure that everybody knows what I'm talking about, it's an archive that was found in 1933 by the American excavations on behalf of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, directed by Ernst Herzfeld in the northeastern sector of the Persepolis Terrace, hence named the Persepolis Fortification Archive. Most tablets are of this type, that are so-called tongue-shaped tablets, usually with interesting seals on their left edges, and there's quite a bunch of them. Today I will talk mainly from the Elamite tablets, of which now around 6,000 have been edited. And some of the latest acquisitions in the edited corpus will be in my talk. One of the things that I like to show when I talk about Achaemenid religion and about different approaches to it is two books. One is by Widengren. I think few people would now use it as a handbook, but there was a time that it was one of the main handbooks. I just show it to you because of its title. It talks about the religions, plural, of Iran. And in this book, there's even an index in it. The word Ilam is not mentioned a single time, because Iranian religion often is defined as anything that starts, at least in Western Iran, with Cyrus. And anything before that is non-Iranian religion and non-Iranian culture. I think that's quite questionable, and I will try to address this issue. It's not me who was the first to raise this issue. It's actually very old, and I cite here George Cameron because I really like this book, but he was not even the first to raise this issue. Cameron, in this quite exemplary book, discusses what he calls the history of early Iran, which he defines as the period from circa 1500 BC to well into the Achaemenid period. So he doesn't see the beginning of the Achaemenid period as a major change or anything. So he of course he does see changes in the almost 1,000 years that he discusses, but he would like to discuss them within one frame, also to show continuities and change. So these two perspectives have always been there. Why is that? Well, it's just a matter of geography to start with. If we look at Elam, this is an estimation, and please don't quote me on this as indicating the real borders or anything of Elam. An estimation of the maximal extent of Elam, and of course not in all periods of its history Elam was as big as this. But just bear in mind that Elam, for some periods, covered major parts of southwestern Iran. Now look at the territory covered by the Persepolis Fortification Archive, again an estimation. Here projected the territory under direct control of the Neo-Elamite state, which existed, as we now think, down to the reign of Darius, or at least down to the reign of Cyrus. This is the territorial control, this is the political extent of the Neo-Elamite state. But if you think of the cultural and economical influence, the sphere of this state, it's much, much bigger. There are not many indications for it, but some indications that I think are worthwhile remembering. So if you look at these various circles indicated here, just from the point of view of geography and chronology, it would be logical to look at Elam as a possible precursor of the Achaemenid state in all kinds of ways, in state traditions, in cultural traditions, in, for instance, writing, administration. All of that should, I think, a priori be considered as a possibility. It's not a dictum that it is like this, but I think it should be part of Achaemenid studies. Another aspect is that within this Achaemenid heartland, there are a number of old Elamite open-air sanctuaries, and there are some indications that some of them were still in use in the Achaemenid period. You may know, I think most of you know, Naxirustam, the site of the Achaemenid royal tombs, starting from the Darius I, in a rock face that is part of a quite impressive, massive ridge that rises quite suddenly from the Marv Dasht, the plain in which also Persepolis is situated. And those of you who know Elamite sanctuaries also know that the Elamites had this preference for sites with a kind of numinous quality in them. At Naxxurustan, you have this quite sudden rise of the rock face, and you have this gorge that certainly when you are there had this sort of imposing quality to it. Furthermore, we nowadays think, I hope this thing works, maybe it doesn't. It doesn't. We have the idea that left and right of these reliefs in ancient times water streams would flow. So we have water, we have the sudden rise of the rock face. There was in antiquity a water basin, and it is usually dated to the Elamite period. And then, of course, there is here on the right, there are the remains of an Elamite sanctuary. Another aspect of this site is its acoustics, and again, that is something that Elamite open-air sanctuaries have in common. It's something that should be studied much more. Yeah, thank you. So there is this landscape quality to the Elamite open-air sanctuaries. This is not just one relief, this is what the point I want to stress, but this is a meaningful landscape. And in this meaningful landscape, there is an Elamite relief, center of the open-air sanctuary, which later on was carved over by a Sasanian king. This is the original relief, the parts of it that are preserved. Now, the interesting aspect that I want to mention is that the figures added to the left and to the right belong to the late New Elamite period, suggesting that people interested in this open-air sanctuary were still paying attention to it to the extent that they even enlarged the relief. I don't want to say that Elamites were doing this, because I think we have to be careful in putting labels on things. But this is an ancient site, and it is a site that continued to be of essential importance under the Achaemenid kings. And this should tell us something. This is actually the outset from which I want to talk. There are many more examples like this, and this is actually a picture that has become more and more clear in recent years. So also from the perspective of archaeology, this is a projection of a survey from an Iranian-Australian team directed by Daniel Potts that has identified Neo-Elamite and Achaemenid sites in a region called Mamazani in the western part of Fars. Here you see the Neo-Elamite sites, here the Achaemenid sites, and most importantly, the sites that were continuously occupied from the Neo-Elamite to the Achaemenid period. These are sites known from surveys, so we don't know for certain that there is a real transition from the Neo-Elamite to the Achaemenid period. But for Tape Nurabat, that has been excavated by the team just mentioned, there is actually a transitional layer. And this is for the first time that we can really witness the transition from Neo-Elamite or Neo-Elamite-like cultures to what we understand as Achaemenid culture. Of course, none of this is the conclusive evidence that one might want to have. But these are building stones, I would say, for a new perspective. Another one is this often cited seal that belongs to one Kurash of Anshan, son of Sheshpesh. And since we have been talking about Citatnamen, I would like to retake this also to stress that, like Mark Garrison, I belong to the Elamite or the Anshanite Politburo, so it's inevitable to cite this. There have been many attempts to find an Indo-Iranian etymology of Kurush. I just cite a few of them, but this is not exhaustive. There's others. I will not discuss them. I will just, because this is actually not about the name, but about the principle, about the outlook. There are several forms of this name in antiquity. There is Kurush in the old Persian versions of the royal inscriptions. There's Kurash in the Elamite seal inscription that I just cited to you, and also Kurash in the Akkadian Cyrus cylinder, and in other inscriptions from Cyrus the Great from Babylonia. So on the one hand, you have the Old Persian form Kurush, and on the other hand, you have the Elamite form and Akkadian form Kurash. Now, for linguists, as you may imagine, to have two different name forms is something really wonderful, because it means that you can try to build an argument on the origin of the name based on this variation. Because either the name Kurash was changed into Kurush for some reason within that language in Old Persian, or the originally Old Persian name Kurush had to be changed, had to be adapted to the form Kurash in Akkadian and Elamite. So these are basically the two possibilities. So the first hypothesis listed here is the one generally assumed still, that is that Elamite Kurash is an adaptation of the Indo-Iranian name Kurush. But there is no reason for this in Elamite. There is no problem with names ending on ush in Elamite. Think of Kurlush or Hutulutush. This is actually quite acceptable in the Elamite language. By contrast, the name Kurash with an A would be difficult in Old Iranian because the short A stems lost their final S. So if you would have to say something like that, you would have to find another similar name, another stem, a U stem, for example, because the U stems in Old Iranian had kept their final S. So this is a logical adaptation. This is, again, not me. This is Carl Friedrich Andreas, originally named Bagratuni, who first raised this, and it was a theory completely ignored. In the century after his proposal, everybody concentrated on finding an Indo-Iranian etymology for Cyrus. Why? Not because it's more likely, because it is actually less likely from the start, but because Cyrus is the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. It was inconceivable that he would have a non-Indo-Iranian name. And I think this is the orientation that has caused that we have really missed part of the background of Achaemenid culture. So I will not bore you with the details of this. I think this is an etymology that can be defended, and it is an etymology for which there are parallels in other names of the same type. It is an abbreviated name in which the theonym itself has dropped. That is something that happens in Elamite names. And actually, you could add to this the name of Teispes or Sheshpesh, that seems to be of the same type, but of a reduplicated form from a base Shepi or Sipi or Shipi, which means to vow. So here is a possibility, and again, it is not, of course, written in stone, but there is a possibility that in the early reigning dynasty of the Persian Empire, there are people with names that might be Elamite. I'm not saying it is like this, but it could be that they are Elamites. Does it mean that they were Elamites? Not at all, not at all. As I said, one should be really careful in putting such easy labels on things. For me, it just is an indication of the cultural matrix in which the Persians came to the world. This is what surrounded them. Elamite culture was a highly developed culture, as Mesopotamian culture was. The Persians, when they started to identify their Persian identity, were in contact with these cultures. So it's not at all strange that some of their early rulers would have Elamite names. Perhaps they didn't even know these were Elamite names. They were traditional names. They were not linguists. They were not necessarily bothering themselves with making etymologies for these names. So just as indications of how I would like to see this. Of course, there is a completely different view as well. Here again, I won't bore you with the details, but on the other hand, it's quite amusing maybe to cite this. As you may know, the early French excavators in Susa also did anthropological researches and ethnographic researches, and in those days that actually simply meant measuring skulls, not only in the archaeological finds, but also in the modern population of Khuzestan and the adjacent regions. we would maybe now call that racist or find it terrible, but in those days that was actually a quite normal thing. And I'm sure that Dieudafroy and his colleagues didn't mean anything ideological or political with it when they were doing this. This really was the thing that you did in those days. But of course, times changed, and these things became meaningful in a quite negative way, as we all know. And they kept being used in this way. Look at this. You all know this. You can go and see it in the Musée du Louvre. This is part of the famous frieze, the relief made of glazed bricks of the so-called Susan Guards from Susa. And the Elamitologist Walter Hinz thought that he could distinct the skin color of these three people. He saw the first as brown, the second as black, and the third as white. And he puts labels on it, and I cite them in German. The first is a Bergelama, that he is brown, so he's of mixed race. The second is black, so he's a pure African, of pure African race. And the third one is white, and then he says, offenbar ein Perser. So because you know, white people must be Aryans in this part of the world. You laugh, but this is 1964. It's not so long ago. It's not so long ago. And now read this in comparison from the same scholar. I will read it for you in English. It's about the migration of the Indo-Iranians into the Persian heartland under Achéménides. And he knows that he can date this around 700 for Christ. Don't ask me why. And Anshan, the old Anshan, becomes Parsa, Fars. It's the old östliche Reichshälfte, Elam, so the former eastern part of Elam. And now what he wants to explain is the fact that in Persepolis, later on, people use Elamite for writing. And how come there are Elamite scribes there, and Persians use these scribes for their administration? How is it possible that they can work with these scribes without having enormous difficulties in understanding their own personnel? So they said, well, he has this theory that they have a kind of passive understanding of Elamite. And how do they arrive at this passive understanding of Elamite? Because in their homes they have servants and nurses, Elamite servants and nurses. And bear in mind that this guy thought of the Elamites as blacks or half-blacks. This really is a situation that spells apartheid. I don't have a different word for it. And mind you again, the date, this is 1971. It's not so long ago. Worse even is what he writes about Cyrus. It always gets worse when people write about Cyrus, as you know. I think it should be forbidden to talk about Cyrus at all. Cyrus, who is always praised, as you know, for liberating the Jews from their Babylonian exile, is here presented as somebody who actually did something very different with this act. It was not on behalf of the Jews that he was doing this, but he was making possible Christ. Without the liberation of the Jews, there would not have been Christianity. So the Jews are not anything more than a tool in the hands of Cyrus, who is really presented as a kind of pre-Messiah who sets into motion, you know, the salvation of the world. Again, I would call this quite dodgy. Good. That was from a book offered by the German Iranologists at the occasion of the coronation of the Iranian Shah. In that same book, in that same publication, Wilhelm Eilers writes interesting things about the purity of the Aryan race. This is again 1971. And he writes, when it comes to religion, he writes about the difference between the Indo-Iranians in India and those in Iran. Because those in India, they have been completely lost. They have been exposed to this horrible phallus cult in India, and they have completely lost their way because of this. But because the Indo-Iranians in Iran noticed what happened to their cousins in India, they distanced themselves from all this impurity and all this horror. So you really see here a vision of racial division which gets connected to religion. It is expressed in religion. Now, of course, this is not an indication of the scholarship of the last 100 years, which is very diverse. And still, I would like to press on this current in the research, because I think it is important to recognize what it did, what kind of influence it had on people. The opposite. We now know the Persepolis Fortification Archive. It has been cited a number of times already. And what has been cited already also is that in this archive you have cults for various gods. We know that because commodities are allocated for these various cults. Sometimes these cults are only known by the type of sacrifice. In those cases, we cannot say anything about the cultural background of the divinities implied. Sometimes they are known by name. In case of the divinities known by name, Humban, who is of Elamite extraction, is the most frequent. He gets a cumulative volume of sacrifices which by far exceeds that of Auramazda. So if we talk in terms of Mazda centrism, I would say that the Persepolis Fortification Archive really is Humban-centric. I mean, based on these numbers. Of course, numbers are just one indication among many others that one would have to include. So we have here quite opposite views about Achaemenid religion. Here also, I will not go into the details, but if you look at the religious landscape, what you will find is, just as a brief summary, you will find people with Iranian names and Iranian titles who sacrifice to Iranian and Elamite gods. You find people with Elamite names and Elamite titles sacrificing to Iranian and Elamite gods, and context and locations and types of sacrifice that are completely mixed. Whatever you try, you will not succeed in distinguishing different religious spheres. As hard as you try, it just really doesn't work. And the result of that is that we have a landscape in which the god Auramazda, who is omnipotent in the royal inscriptions, appears to be of much less importance. Now, take a step back and think of the glorious Indo-Iranians who brought to Iran a superior culture and also a religion that is often portrayed as better, as more enlightened, and that made a fundamental change when they came to Western Iran. And with this fundamental change made their world empire, which was built on fundamentally different principles. Then, of course, it's worrying to find, say, on the working floor of the Persepolis Fortification Archive, a situation which does not at all agree with that. So, what have people tried? They have tried to read their view of the royal inscriptions into this material. And one of the ways to do that was to look at these exchange texts in which non-animal commodities like grain are issued and they are exchanged for livestock, and then the livestock is sacrificed for gods. And one of the ideas about this has been that this is Elamite priests who secretly change the grain to livestock because the official government forbids animal sacrifices because it is Zoroastrian. And so these Elamite priests, as it is described, they have found a little loophole and they abuse, as it were, the generosity of the Persian king who gives them grain for their ancestral sacrifices. They abuse it, they change it into livestock, and they make their horrible animal sacrifices with it, secretly. Now, of course, this is an absurd theory because it is documented. All this secrecy is documented in the official documents of the Heartland administration. So it would be very strange that this hypocrisy that is suggested by these scholars would be documented meticulously in this archive. There's no way you could justify that, I think. And actually, what is happening here is something completely different. It's something economic. And that is another aspect that one has to stress. These texts are not about religion. They are about an economic, institutional, household economy. They don't want to inform us about religion. We can be happy that we can extract some information about cults from them, but they were not intended to give this information. Now, in terms of exchange, what they are doing is they try, that's at least my understanding of it, they try to preserve their capital in animals. They don't like to issue animals because that represents a commodity that they can keep for a longer time. So what they like to do is to issue grain, because grain is something you cannot keep for a long time, and to have it exchanged with external parties, and in this way provide for the sacrifices. So it is a rational economic operation that we see here, and for this reason it is documented in the archive. Again, something that I show to illustrate how different perspectives create completely different realities looking at the same material. The other one, and this brings us back to Auramazda, is the position of Auramazda. Some scholars had difficulty in accepting the role of Auramazda, which seemed little in the archive, and they proposed that the so-called Lan sacrifice, which has been mentioned a few times already, is the exclusive sacrifice for Auramazda. It is, in the published material, never connected to any named god. So you can actually say that it is for anybody. You can have this theory. I have, when I worked on this material, I have tried to find all kinds of reasons why this doesn't work. I have studied the context, the personnel involved, the frequency, the quantities, whatever. All of that did not match the few sacrifices that we do have for Auramazda. So it seemed problematic at the start, but I never had the definitive proof of it. Now, as always, once you have published something, then the proof that you always wanted pops up. This is a tablet that Matt Stolper recently found, and he gave it to me, probably suspecting that I would be happy with it, which I was. It is a journal. A journal is actually a register. It is a text that summarizes a number of these tongue-shaped tablets, a number of individual transactions. And it starts out with travel rations for people on the way to Media or coming from Media. And that means that we are talking about a region which is north of the area normally covered by the Persepolis archive. It's a bit of a strange area. We know it a lot from registers and accounts, but we don't know it from these little tongue-shaped tablets. And because of this, we don't know exactly how big it was. So in that sense, it's a bit of a mysterious region. But I can be quite certain that the tablet I just showed to you belongs to this region. So it's quite far north. And I have to stress this because in this same tablet, what you find is a person with a name that seems Iranian. He is a Magush, and he makes a land sacrifice, and it is for Napirisha. This is an earthquake. This is the first time that Lan is connected really to any named deity, and it is not Auramazda, it is a bloody Elamite god. Terrible, terrible, absolutely terrible. Does this mean that all these land sacrifices that I just listed for you were for this Elamite god? Not at all, not at all. Actually, I think that it is a quite common type of sacrifice, defined more by its frequency, by the type of commodities used for it, also by its economic role. It is a kind of basic income for people with cultic responsibility in the archive. And I think it could be for Napirisha, but it could also be for other gods. But in any case, it means that Lan was not exclusively for Auramazda. And that changes, again, a lot, I would say. We'll skip a few things because Pierre makes a threatening move. And let me see how I finish this. I can skip all of this. So we will be finished soon, don't worry. And we have already talked about these things anyhow. So we come back then to the original situation that the tablet suggests, namely that Auramazda is not so frequently mentioned in it. And I would say that one has to find an explanation for that with the acceptance of this fact, and try to find in the context of the archive and in the context of the inscription an explanation for this. Now, the few times that Auramazda occurs, it often is in the context of a feast called Bakadaushia, Bakadaushiam in Elamite, and there is a limited range of gods that is mentioned with this particular sacrifice. And my theory which I explain in more detail in the paper that was circulated, is that the choice of these deities is not a coincidence. They have names that seem to be appropriate in an ideological context, or they are leading gods connected to kings. Now, Mishdushish and Perda, they have names that one could imagine have a significant role in an institutional household economy with thousands of dependent laborers that barely exist. They really live on quite minimal rations. And in this system, there is a sort of supplementary system of bonus rations. There are all kinds of incentives for these workers. For instance, when women get children, they will get extra rations. And there are all kinds of other extra rations. There is this whole ideology within this really hard-working institution of, you know, reward, of a giving king that tries to take care of these people. Now, feasts are not just feasts. They are an occasion where simple workers will get access to higher rations, sometimes to meat, sometimes to wine, sometimes to fruit, which they do not normally get. And in this context, you find these gods. I think that is not a coincidence. So again, you know, you have to have the internal context. Now, what does it mean for Auramazda?
Don't forget my frightening move.
Yes, yeah. And I know you will be worse and worse, so I will be very quick. Why Humban and Auramazda in this context? First, Humban. Humban became the leading Elamite god in the New Elamite period, and he is intimately connected with kings. Elamite kings in the New Elamite period preferably have the name of Humban in their name. There's a very significant increase in those names. And there is also a text that suggests that specifically Humban is the one who gives his protection, his numinous power to the king. It is Humban under whose kitten a king stands. Now, when you compare that to Auramazda, I think it compares well. They are these personal gods that are not only royal gods in the sense that we have seen earlier as Assur in the Assyrian context, but there are gods that really closely operate with the king that they protect. And if you look at the Bisutun inscription, I think, but maybe this is just my limited impression of it, I think that the basic role of Auramazda in this inscription is to collaborate with the king. And this is not an easy effort. This is hard work, really hard work. In the Elamite version, this is stressed again and again. Auramazda makes an effort. It's not an easy year for the supreme god. Nor is it, and this is really my conclusion, is it for poor Darius, because he has to work hard as well. He says, I exerted my power, and the verb that is used has the same stem as the effort that is in effort of Auramazda. So it is a joint effort of king and god. I'm not saying that Auramazda's image here is one-to-one taken from Humban, but I am saying that if we want to study Achaemenid religion in its full scope, if we really want to have all the backgrounds of it, then we cannot limit ourselves to one tradition. We have to see it against this mosaic of sources, and we also have to see the polyphony in it. Thank you.